In the summer of 1846, in Charleston, South Carolina, a story began that the Beaumont family would spend generations trying to hide. It started not in the markets or on the docks, but in the grand house on East Bay Street where profit wore silk and silence was law. Jonathan Beaumont, freshly returned from London, carried ideas too dangerous for his father's world. And in that world of chandeliers and chains, he met Evelyn, a housemaid whose quiet strength would change everything. What followed was not written in ledgers or court records, but in whispers and hidden glances of forbidden love that defied the laws of men and the will of blood. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories they tried to bury, deserve to live again. And tell me, where are you listening from right now? Let's see how far their secret still reaches. Now, let us return to that house by the harbor, where wealth and sorrow lived under the same roof, and where one moment of kindness began a story that was never meant to remember. This is where it all began: the merchant's son, the enslaved woman, and a love the world tried to erase forever. Charleston, 1846. A city balanced between progress and decay, where the ocean wind carried both the perfume of magnolia and the stench of human bondage. The docks were alive with motion that morning, sailors shouting over the creak of ropes, horses pulling wagons heavy with cotton bales, and merchants in tailored coats discussing fortunes made from sugar, indigo, and lives they did not own. The great Atlantic shimmered beyond the harbor, its tides whispering secrets of distant lands, but within the city's narrow streets, history felt trapped, looping endlessly between profit and punishment. At the heart of it all stood the Beaumont family. Their firm, Beaumont & Sons Trading Company, was more than a business. It was an empire built on exchange and exploitation. Ships bearing their crest, an iron anchor encircled by laurel, moved between Charleston, Havana, and Liverpool. Inside their offices on East Bay Street, ledgers filled with precise handwriting told stories that would never reach newspapers or sermons. Each line was a life quantified in pounds sterling. Alaric Beaumont, the patriarch, believed himself a man of civilization. He attended church every Sunday, quoted Cicero at dinner, and told his son that commerce was the purest form of order. Yet behind his refinement hid the quiet brutality of numbers of debtors ruined, sailors lost, and enslaved labor measured in fractions of yield. The Beaumont mansion rose only a few streets inland, white pillars gleaming under the relentless Carolina Sunday. Its marble floors had been polished by generations of hands that would never walk them freely. In the garden, camellias bloomed beside iron fences, their petals falling silently onto the brick walkways like confessions the city refused to speak aloud. The house was a symbol of permanence in a world built on transience, and within its walls, one secret would soon unravel everything it stood for. Alaric's wealth was old, his reputation older. He wore his authority like a tailored coat, measured, deliberate, unwrinkled by guilt. But his greatest pride was his only son, Jonathan Beaumont, newly returned from London after 2 years of study. Jonathan brought with him ideas that did not fit Charleston's world talk of liberty, equality, and a growing unease with the necessary evil his father defended as commerce. He saw the city not as a triumph of industry, but as a gilded cage, its beauty built upon bones. That morning, as the bells of St. Philip's tolled across the harbor, Jonathan looked out from his carriage window and saw what he could no longer unsee: men and women moving in chains behind the same docks where merchants toasted prosperity. The city was a paradox, refined and rotten, elegant and cruel. It was here, amid the wealth of his father's making, that Jonathan Beaumont would meet the woman who would destroy his inheritance and redefine his soul. The story of their love begins not in passion, but in contradiction, in a city that worshipped God on Sunday and sold his children on Monday, where one man's fortune was another's cage, and where every heartbeat carried the echo of something forbidden waiting to be born. The ship from London entered Charleston harbor at sunrise, cutting through waters stained copper by the reflection of dawn. The masts groaned in the wind, gulls screamed overhead, and the scent of salt and tar filled the air as the city unfolded on the horizon, a landscape of steeples, sails, and smoke. Among the passengers standing on deck was Jonathan Beaumont, 22 years old, the only son of Alaric Beaumont, heir to the wealth and legacy of one of Charleston's most powerful merchant dynasties. To the other travelers, he looked like privilege personified: immaculate coat, fine boots, and the posture of someone who had never carried more than a book in his hands. But beneath that polished surface, something had shifted. London had changed him. For 2 years he had walked the cobblestone streets of empire, studied beneath vaulted ceilings, and heard men speak openly of liberty and reform. He had sat in coffeehouses where ideas flowed faster than the Thames, where abolitionists argued with industrialists, and where words like equality were spoken without irony. Those conversations clung to him as stubbornly as the coal smoke that blackened London's sky. He returned home not as his father's obedient successor, but as a man who had begun to see the world differently, a dangerous transformation in a city built on obedience. As the ship anchored, Charleston's harbor revealed its true nature. Behind the elegant facades of warehouses and counting houses, the docks swarmed with laborers whose sweat paid for the silks and wines that lined the parlors of East Bay Street. The cries of auctioneers echoed faintly from nearby yards where human lives were still traded in daylight. Jonathan felt an unease he could not disguise, a fracture between the education he had received abroad and the foundation of the life waiting for him ashore. The carriage that met him bore the family crest, freshly polished for his return. As it rolled through the narrow streets, he recognized landmarks from childhood: the market, the church steeple, the endless row of grand houses whose beauty seemed more fragile than he remembered. Yet everything looked smaller now, as though knowledge had enlarged the world and made Charleston seem provincial, trapped in its own illusion of permanence. His father awaited him at the house on East Bay Street, the same place where contracts were signed and destinies decided. Jonathan imagined the conversation to come: polite inquiries, restrained pride, and the unspoken expectation that he would take his place within the family business. But what awaited him was more than reunion, it was collision, for the ideals he carried home from across the Atlantic would soon meet the immovable stone of his father's empire. And in that collision, the story of the Beaumonts and of the woman whose name would rewrite their history would truly begin. The Beaumont mansion stood like a fortress of refinement on East Bay Street, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon light, its wide verandas catching every whisper of the Atlantic breeze. To passers-by, it was a symbol of Charleston's prosperity, the perfect blend of European taste and Southern ambition. The marble that adorned its entrance had been quarried in Italy and shipped across oceans, but the hands that carried it, polished it, and laid it into place had come from far closer, bought, branded, and bound to the Beaumont name. Inside those walls, wealth was more than visible. It was tangible, woven into the draperies, etched into the furniture, and stitched into the silence that followed every command. Alaric Beaumont believed his home reflected order, discipline, and divine favor. The parlor floors shone like mirrors, the crystal chandeliers caught every flicker of candlelight, and the portraits of his ancestors watched over each room with severe, unblinking eyes. The air itself seemed trained to behave, perfumed with magnolia oil and the faintest trace of cigar smoke. Servants moved quietly through the halls, their presence noticed only by the sound of footsteps quickly withdrawn. It was a world designed to look eternal, yet beneath its polish lay a constant tremor of fear and exhaustion. Among those who served was Evelyn, a young woman whose grace seemed both a blessing and a curse. She was no older than 20, slender and steady, with eyes that carried both light and sorrow. To those who watched her pass through the house, she appeared composed, but her silence was not submission, it was survival. She belonged to Margaret Beaumont, Alaric's wife, who prized refinement above all things. Evelyn's duties were endless: pressing gowns, pouring tea, arranging flowers, reading aloud when Margaret's eyes grew tired. She performed them with precision, aware that a single mistake could summon the sting of discipline. The mansion's beauty concealed its cruelty. Every polished surface had been purchased with labor that left no fingerprints behind. Every imported rug muffled footsteps of those whose freedom had been sold to pay for it. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the city quieted, the walls of the Beaumont home seemed to breathe the sighs of those who built it, still lingering in the mortar. It was in this house, where silence served as both armor and prison, that Evelyn lived unseen yet always observed, her every motion measured against her mistress's moods. Beyond the grandeur and order, something restless stirred. The youngest Beaumont had returned from abroad, and with him came questions that no one in that house dared ask. As Jonathan Beaumont walked those halls for the first time in years, the world his father built awaited him in perfect stillness, fragile, glittering, and ready to crack. And among the faces he passed, one would soon become the center of that fracture. Evelyn. The quiet shadow in the house that would teach him the cost of love in a world built to deny it. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Beaumont parlor, turning the air to gold and dust to glitter. Outside, the city hummed with the rhythm of trade and tide, but inside, time seemed to move more slowly, wrapped in the hush of domestic ritual. The scent of fresh camellias filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of lemon oil on polished wood. It was here, in this carefully ordered sanctuary of wealth and silence, that two lives first brushed against one another in a moment that neither would ever forget. Jonathan Beaumont had risen early, restless since his return. The world he had come home to felt unchanged, yet he himself no longer fit within it. The echo of London still followed him, the sound of debate, the smell of rain on stone, the conviction that life was more than what his father's generation had decreed. As he wandered through the house, he found himself studying its details with new eyes, the imported rugs, the portraits of ancestors who seemed carved from the same cold marble as their home, the unspoken rules that governed every movement of those who served within its walls. That was when he saw her. Evelyn stood near the window, arranging flowers in a porcelain vase so delicate it seemed unworthy of the hands that held it. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her focus unbroken, her movements graceful yet unhurried. The morning light caught her skin and turned it to warm amber. A single strand of hair slipped loose against her cheek, and for a moment, Jonathan forgot to breathe. It was not beauty that arrested him, though she was beautiful. It was the quiet dignity in her posture, the calm defiance in the way she occupied a space never meant for her to be seen. Evelyn did not look up immediately. When she finally did, her eyes met his, and the world seemed to still. There was no word spoken, no acknowledgement of what had passed. Yet something invisible shifted in the room, a spark, dangerous and alive, igniting in the silence between them. For a heartbeat, they were not master and servant, not merchant's son and enslaved woman, but two souls startled by the recognition of something forbidden yet familiar. Then the moment ended. The sound of footsteps in the hall, the rustle of skirts, the return of order. But for Jonathan, the image remained Evelyn in the morning light, framed by flowers and sunlight, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. He did not yet understand that this fleeting instant would divide his life into before and after, that what began as curiosity would become conviction, and that love, in a house like his, was not a gift but a sentence waiting to be written. In the Beaumont household, silence was more than the absence of sound. It was a system, a code, a weapon, and sometimes the only form of safety left to those who had none. Every word spoken within its walls carried weight, every pause was measured, and every glance could betray more than one intended. For Evelyn, silence had long been her survival. She had learned to move through rooms without presence, to speak only when addressed, to listen when others forgot she could hear. But Jonathan Beaumont had not grown up fluent in that unspoken language. He was learning it now, without instruction, drawn toward it like a man drawn to flame. The days following their first encounter in the parlor unfolded with the deceptive calm of a tide before a storm. Jonathan began to find reasons innocent at first to linger in the parts of the house where Evelyn worked. A misplaced book on a side table, a sudden interest in the arrangement of the garden flowers, a question about the portraits that lined the upstairs hall. He told himself it was curiosity, perhaps admiration for the quiet efficiency with which she carried herself. Yet even he knew it was something deeper. The rhythm of her presence began to fill the spaces that once felt empty. Evelyn noticed, though she pretended not to. She was too wise, too seasoned by the dangers of attention, to mistake politeness for safety. The son of the master was not a man one ignored, but neither was he a man one encouraged. And yet, She could not deny that something in his manner was different, an unease that set him apart from the others, a gentleness that both intrigued and frightened her. In a world built upon command and obedience, Jonathan seemed out of place, as though he too was trapped within the walls his father had built. Their communication became a delicate pattern of observation. He would leave books in rooms she entered, pages marked with poetry that spoke of longing and loss. She would replace them quietly, never commenting, yet leaving the faintest trace of lavender from her hands on the covers. Their eyes would meet in passing, not long enough to invite suspicion, but long enough for something unspoken to take root. It was a dangerous ritual, this language of silence, a conversation carried not by words but by the tension that grew with every near encounter. Beneath the polished stillness of the Beaumont mansion, beneath its order and ritual, something human and volatile had begun to stir. Neither of them could name it yet, but both could feel it, the slow, inevitable pull of two lives moving toward one another in a world that would destroy them if it ever found out. The sound of carriage wheels echoed along the cobblestones outside Beaumont and Sons Trading Company as another shipment arrived from the coast. Inside the counting room, sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, illuminating dust that drifted like quiet ghosts between ledgers and inkpots. The smell of sea brine lingered on the crates that bore the marks of Charleston's latest trade sugar, tobacco, textiles, and what the ledgers called human chattel. Alaric Beaumont oversaw it all with the precision of a banker and the detachment of a man who had long learned to separate numbers from souls. Each name entered in his thick leather-bound ledger represented a fortune earned or a debt settled. That morning, his quill scratched across the page, recording new acquisitions from a coastal auction near Georgetown. His voice was calm, mechanical, as he read the details to his clerk. Male, 17 years of age. Laborer. Sound condition. Purchased for $840. Jonathan Beaumont stood nearby, silent but watchful. His father had summoned him to observe what he called the foundation of commerce, insisting that no heir to the family empire should be ignorant of its inner workings. But as the names continued, Jonathan's stomach turned. It was not the figures or the transaction that unsettled him. It was the sudden, familiar word that froze the air around him. Noah. He heard it once, quietly spoken by a clerk confirming inventory. The name, common enough in the South, might have meant nothing to another man. But Jonathan remembered it the way Evelyn had once whispered it when she thought no one could hear, the way her eyes clouded whenever she lingered near the harbor's direction. Noah. Her brother. He moved closer to the ledger, pretending to study the ink. The entry confirmed it. 17. Sold from the same region where Evelyn had been born. The handwriting beneath the column read assigned to domestic service at East Bay residence. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. His father's empire had drawn another soul into its orbit, and fate had delivered that soul directly into their home. By sunset, the house was quiet again. In the rear courtyard, where the servants' quarters stood, a new arrival knelt by the well, washing the salt from his skin. Evelyn saw him through the narrow window of the kitchen and dropped the porcelain bowl she was holding. It shattered against the floor, but she did not move. Her breath caught, her body trembling as she realized the impossible. Noah was there, thin, older, his eyes hollow but still hers. No words were exchanged when they met that night. They stood facing one another in the dim glow of the servant lamps, too afraid to speak. Tears were a luxury neither could afford. In silence, they reached out, hands meeting for the first time in years, bound by blood and chains in the same house that had stolen everything from them. For Jonathan, watching from the shadows, that moment became the one he would never forget, the instant when love turned to duty and silence began to demand action. Charleston's elite gathered beneath the glittering chandeliers of Drayton Hall that evening, their laughter rising above the strains of a waltz played by a hired string quartet. The grand ballroom smelled of jasmine, tobacco, and wealth, a perfume made from luxury and sin. Every inch of the hall gleamed with the confidence of a city that believed itself eternal. Silk gowns rustled against marble floors, and men in tailcoats boasted of shipments, crops, and prophets, as if God himself had appointed them custodians of the world's order. The air was thick with vanity, the kind that could only exist where suffering had been made invisible. Jonathan Beaumont stood near the edge of the crowd, surrounded by faces his father called the backbone of the South. They were men who measured virtue by acreage and humanity by yield. He had attended such gatherings since childhood, yet tonight the noise felt different, harsher, hollow, as if every toast was made to a ghost. The talk had turned from harvests to bloodlines, from cotton to breeding. Words like value and stock floated through the air with a casual cruelty that made Jonathan's chest tighten. It was not the first time he had heard men speak of people as property, but never before had he listened with Evelyn's face in his mind. When he saw her enter the room, carrying a silver tray of wine glasses, time seemed to stutter. Evelyn moved with the same quiet grace she always carried, her eyes lowered, her steps measured. The guests saw only service, never the soul behind it. To them, she was an ornament of the evening, a detail as unremarkable as the candles or the music. But to Jonathan, she was the only human being in that room of polished monsters. As she passed among the guests, conversation shifted like a serpent. A planter from Savannah laughed too loudly, gesturing toward her with his glass, boasting about the beauty of mixed stock. Another responded that light skin fetched a higher price, especially for house servants. Their wives tittered, pretending not to hear. Jonathan's stomach turned cold. Every word struck him like a blade. They spoke of her as though she were a specimen, a transaction, a breeding calculation in the ledgers he had learned to despise. He caught his reflection in the ballroom mirror, his father's eyes, his father's blood, and felt shame crawl across his skin. He realized in that moment that the civilization he had been raised to inherit was nothing more than cruelty dressed in elegance. The chandeliers above him shimmered like cages of light, trapping every lie that wealth could afford. And as Evelyn disappeared once more into the sea of silks and laughter, something inside Jonathan Beaumont broke beyond repair. He would never again be able to stand among them and call himself their kind. Behind the Beaumont mansion, where the marble steps gave way to a tangle of earth and color, there lay a small walled garden known only to a few. It was a place his mother had once called her refuge, a sanctuary of camellias and magnolias that thrived even in the thick Charleston heat. Time had softened it, ivy crept along the bricks, petals fell and carpeted the ground like faded silk, but its stillness held a kind of grace untouched by the world beyond its walls. It was there, one quiet afternoon, that Jonathan Beaumont found Evelyn. She was bent over the camellias, trimming the browned edges of their blossoms, her sleeves rolled just above the wrist. The sunlight filtered through the leaves and danced across her skin in shifting patterns, as though the garden itself had chosen to guard her. The distant hum of the city faded, replaced by the sound of bees and the whisper of her breath. For Jonathan, it felt as if he had stumbled into another realm entirely, one where beauty was not owned, catalogued, or bought, but simply existed. Until that moment, every word between them had been bound by propriety and silence. But here, away from the polished corridors of the mansion, something fragile began to loosen inside him. Evelyn did not look up when he entered, though she must have sensed him there. Years of survival had trained her to notice everything, the shift of air, the sound of a step. He watched her for a moment longer than he should have, then realized that silence between them had begun to speak louder than words ever could. In that hidden garden, the world's order faltered. The man who was meant to command found himself uncertain, and the woman who had been made invisible became the only presence that mattered. Their voices, when they finally broke the stillness, carried caution, not yet intimacy. Words were few, but meaning filled the space between them. It was not conversation that passed between them, it was recognition. Two lives divided by law and lineage had, for a fleeting instant, met as equals in a world that allowed neither of them to be free. When she finally looked at him, sunlight caught her eyes, just as it had the first day in the parlor, and the moment expanded into something dangerous and electric. Jonathan understood, without fully knowing how, that this place and this woman would become his undoing. What began in that garden was not love, not yet, but something far more perilous, trust. And once it was lit, no power of Charleston, no law written in ink or blood, could ever extinguish it. The storm arrived without mercy. By late afternoon, the sky above Charleston had turned the color of iron, and the air carried the heavy stillness that precedes catastrophe. Along the harbor, ships strained against their moorings, sails ripped like paper, and the gulls vanished inland. The first drops of rain struck the city like warnings, and by nightfall, the wind was howling through the streets, tearing shutters from windows, and bending the palms until they nearly kissed the ground. Charleston, proud and stately, seemed to bow before the wrath of something older and far more powerful than wealth or lineage. Inside the Beaumont mansion, the world narrowed to flickering candlelight and the relentless pounding of rain. Alaric Beaumont barked orders as if shouting at the storm could bend it to his will. Servants hurried to secure doors and cover windows, their movements frantic yet disciplined. When the wind began to tear through the upper floors, Alaric made a decision that chilled Jonathan to the bone. He ordered every enslaved servant to be locked in the cellar beneath the house for safety, he said. But his tone carried no compassion. It was not safety he sought. It was control. Jonathan watched as the cellar door was bolted from the outside, as frightened eyes disappeared into darkness. The storm raged louder. But the sound that haunted him most was not the thunder, it was the silence that followed the lock's final click. Something inside him shifted then. Something that had been tightening since the night of the ball. The world his father ruled was collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty, and Jonathan could no longer pretend not to see it. When the mansion trembled under a violent gust, Jonathan seized his moment. He waited until his father retreated to the study, then descended into the corridor with a lantern clutched tight against the wind that roared through the broken panes. The cellar door loomed before him, its iron latch glistening with moisture. His hands shook as he lifted it, the storm screaming in approval beyond the walls. The door opened to blackness. The air was thick with damp earth and fear. His lantern cast a pale circle of light, revealing faces drawn tight with terror. And then he saw her. Evelyn sat against the far wall, her hands clasped around her knees, her body trembling from cold and dread. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to fade. He moved toward her, and when his hand reached out hesitant, uncertain, she did not pull away. Their fingers met, and in that touch was everything the world forbade. Thunder cracked above them, shaking dust from the ceiling, and the lantern's flame flickered between them like a secret struggling to survive. For the first time, Jonathan understood what defiance felt like, not spoken in words or shouted from pulpits, but whispered through touch, in the dark, against the will of gods and men. The storm would pass by morning, leaving Charleston drowned and broken, but its true destruction had already begun. In that cellar, between two souls who were never meant to meet as equals, something irreversible had been set free. By the winter of 1846, the grand illusion of Beaumont and Sons began to crack beneath its own weight. For years, Alaric Beaumont's reputation had been untouchable, a merchant prince of Charleston, a man who could turn cotton into gold and gold into influence. His name appeared in ledgers across the Atlantic, written in the same elegant script as the kings of commerce he admired. But beneath the polish of that success, debt had begun to bloom like rot beneath fine wood. The British financiers who once toasted his genius were now whispering of insolvency. Ships delayed by storms, warehouses burned by lightning, and speculation gone awry in the Caribbean had drained his reserves. What had once been empire was now a house of cards trembling in the salt wind. Charleston society still smiled when Alaric passed. His dinner table remained full, his servants still perfectly dressed, but the merchants who owed him favors had grown quiet. Letters from London arrived, sealed in wax and scented with threat. They spoke in polite phrases of delinquent remittances and deferred obligations, but the meaning was clear: pay or perish. The fortune that had once built his mansion now threatened to unmake it. Pride would not allow him to show weakness. Alaric had clawed his way into the ranks of the city's elite through intellect and ruthlessness, and he would not be undone by numbers on paper. When the debts became too visible to ignore, he turned to Judge Horatio Blythe, a man as calculating as he was cruel. Blythe, Charleston's chief arbiter of both law and morality, had a reputation for solving problems discreetly. He understood that money and justice were threads of the same fabric, woven to favor those who could pay. Their meetings were held in the judge's office, a place that smelled of ink, whiskey, and power. Blythe listened as Alaric laid out his predicament, every word wrapped in pride and desperation. When the merchant finished, Blythe leaned back and offered the kind of advice that passed for wisdom in that age. If Alaric wished to preserve his fortune, he must reduce his expenses, liquidate his slower assets, and most effectively sell what he called his surplus labor. The suggestion was delivered with the indifference of a man discussing grain. To Blythe, human beings were figures in an equation, and misery was merely a cost of doing business. Alaric, for all his civility, understood the logic. The ledger would balance if he chose to make it so. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows of the mansion, the master of Beaumont and Sons sat at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and silence. The ink beneath his quill recorded not transactions, but lives. In the cold arithmetic of desperation, names became currency, and salvation came at a human price. Unpaid debts demanded payment, and Alaric Beaumont was a man who had never failed to deliver. What he did not yet know was that one of the names soon to be written into his salvation would tear apart everything he had ever built. Evening had settled over Charleston with the heavy stillness that comes before summer rain. The Beaumont mansion glowed faintly against the darkening sky, its lamps flickering through tall windows like watchful eyes. Inside, the walls held the quiet hum of wealth, the rustle of silk, the murmur of servants, the clinking of crystal. As Alaric Beaumont poured himself another glass of brandy, he sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, the air thick with cigar smoke and unspoken worry. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters like a whisper of judgment. Jonathan had not meant to linger outside his father's study that night. He had come seeking conversation, perhaps reconciliation, but what he heard instead froze him where he stood. The voices within were low and deliberate. Alaric's measured tone, and another man's thicker, foreign, touched by the accent of Louisiana. They spoke not of trade or tobacco, but of people. The words were cold, efficient, stripped of humanity. One name cut through the haze like a blade. Evelyn. The New Orleans trader was offering a generous price for her and two others. He claimed she was refined, well-trained, suitable for domestic service in a wealthy Creole household. Jonathan felt his breath catch as if the air itself had turned to ash. He pressed closer to the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. His father's response came calm and certain, the voice of a man speaking not about a woman but about a ledger entry. "Yes," Alaric said. "If it settles the account, I will part with her." Jonathan's world contracted in that instant. The house that had once seemed so vast, so indestructible, suddenly felt suffocating. When he finally entered the room, the storm that had been building in him since London broke loose. His father looked up, surprised but not shaken. Their eyes met across the expanse of the desk, one pair cold and calculating, the other burning with disbelief. The confrontation that followed was quiet only in sound. Jonathan demanded to know how a man could barter away a soul as though it were furniture. Alaric replied with the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a child. To him the matter was simple: property, not person. Evelyn's sale was no act of cruelty, only necessity. The debts were due, the empire must stand, and sentiment had no place in the machinery of survival. Jonathan's words came fast, unguarded, dangerous. He spoke of conscience, of London, of freedom. He called his father's logic a sickness disguised as order. Alaric listened without anger until Jonathan uttered the word that no son of Charleston's merchant class was ever meant to say aloud: enslavement. The mask cracked then. Alaric rose from his chair, his face a map of fury and disbelief. He reminded Jonathan of who he was, of what blood ran in his veins, of what civilization demanded. "You will inherit nothing," he warned, his voice sharp as the snap of a whip, "if you forget what you are." The words hung between them like smoke. Jonathan left the room without reply, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The mansion that had raised him no longer felt like home, but like a monument to every sin he had begun to understand. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor, and lightning flashed against the horizon, casting the house in brief, ghostly light. For the first time, Jonathan saw his father's empire not as a triumph, but as a prison built from other people's suffering. That night, as the rain began to fall, he stood by his window watching the city drown in silver. He thought of Evelyn somewhere below those same roofs, unaware that her fate had already been traded. The wind rattled the glass, and he made a silent vow that would shape the rest of his life. The cracks in the Beaumont family's facade had begun to show, and through them, a storm far greater than the one outside was about to rise. The moon hung low over Charleston that night, veiled in a haze that softened the world into shades of silver and shadow. Behind the Beaumont mansion, the orchard stretched wide and quiet, rows of magnolia trees heavy with bloom. Their petals glowed faintly in the pale light, their perfume thick and intoxicating. It was a place the family rarely visited at night, but for Jonathan and Evelyn, it had become a sanctuary, a fragment of earth untouched by judgment, where the air seemed to hold its breath in reverence for what dared not be spoken aloud. Jonathan waited there long after midnight, the hum of insects blending with the distant rustle of the harbor wind. The storm from the previous week had left the ground soft and fragrant, the scent of wet soil rising like memory. When he finally saw her appear at the edge of the path, carrying a small lantern dimmed to a flicker, the world seemed to pause. She moved like part of the landscape itself, her steps soundless, her face calm, though her eyes betrayed the danger of what they were about to do. In that secret garden of darkness and moonlight, they stood facing each other, the silence between them alive with everything neither could safely say. For Jonathan, words tumbled in his mind faster than he could form them. The decision he had made felt reckless, perhaps impossible, but it was the only truth left to him. He told her what he had sworn in the solitude of his own room, that he would buy her freedom, that he would find a way to sever her name from his father's ledger, that he could no longer live beneath a roof built on the sale of souls. His voice trembled with conviction, though deep within, he knew the scale of what he promised. Evelyn listened without interruption, her face unreadable, her lantern light flickering across the planes of her skin. When she finally spoke, her words were quiet but carried the weight of centuries. She told him that love, in their world, was not a language the law understood, that men like his father had written rules strong enough to strangle even the purest heart, that the moment affection crossed the boundary between master and servant, it ceased to be tenderness and became transgression. Her voice did not tremble. She had lived too long within the confines of power to mistake desire for deliverance. But even as she spoke, the distance between them began to close, drawn not by will but by inevitability. Jonathan stepped closer, not as a master, not as a savior, but as a man stripped of every pretense he had been taught to wear. The magnolias swayed gently above them, their petals falling like soft rain, and the scent of the blossoms seemed to thicken the air. When their hands finally touched, it felt less like defiance and more like surrender. Their eyes met, and in that suspended heartbeat, they understood that what they shared could never belong to the daylight. When their lips met, it was not passion that guided them but recognition, the ache of two souls who had found one another across an unbridgeable divide. The kiss was brief, trembling, and absolute. The world seemed to tilt with it, and when they parted, the night itself felt altered. Somewhere beyond the orchard walls, a clock struck the hour, each chime echoing like a warning. They both knew what it meant. In that moment, beneath the magnolia trees, they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What bound them now was not freedom, but fate, a love that would live only in shadow, fragile as the petals that covered their feet, and just as doomed to fall. The first to notice the change was not Alaric Beaumont or his watchful wife, but Silas Redd, the overseer whose eyes missed nothing that promised profit. He had served the Beaumont estate for more than a decade, a man whose authority over the enslaved was matched only by the cruelty he used to keep it. His skin was sunburnt and leathery, his voice a rasp that carried easily across the fields, and his loyalty, such as it was, had always been for sale. He ruled through fear and silence, feeding on the power that came from controlling those who had none. But lately, the rhythm of the household had shifted in ways he could not explain. Orders were followed, chores completed, and yet there lingered a strange undercurrent in the air, a tension that did not belong to the usual hierarchy of command. It began with glances. Silas had a talent for reading faces, and when he saw Jonathan Beaumont pass through the courtyard one morning with a distracted air, his curiosity stirred. A few days later, he saw Evelyn leaving the garden just as Jonathan entered from the other side. It could have been coincidence, but the overseer had long since stopped believing in coincidences. He started watching more closely, moving silently through the property with the practiced stealth of a hunter. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. A hand that lingered too long on a gate, a look exchanged when neither thought they were being observed, the faintest trace of something forbidden blooming between them. For Silas Red, discovery was not outrage, it was opportunity. He had seen men destroyed by secrets far smaller than this one, and he knew exactly how to turn such knowledge into currency. The world they lived in offered few paths to advancement for a man of his class, but blackmail, he believed, was as valuable as gold. He waited for the right moment, studying Jonathan's movements, learning his routines, and savoring the thought of the leverage he now possessed. One humid afternoon, when the air felt thick enough to choke on, Silas made his move. He cornered Jonathan near the carriage house, his tone laced with false respect. He spoke not as a subordinate, but as a man delivering a warning. He mentioned the walks in the orchard, the quiet meetings, the whispers that might one day reach Alaric Beaumont's ears. His meaning was clear long before he named his price. If Jonathan wanted silence, it would cost him. Money, favors, perhaps even influence in the business his father controlled, anything that proved how desperate he was to keep his secret safe. Jonathan felt the walls closing in long before the overseer's words were finished. The risk was no longer just his own. Evelyn's safety now hung in the balance of a man's greed. Silas saw the fear in his face and knew he had him. To a predator like Red, fear was the truest form of wealth. That night, as thunder murmured far out at sea, the overseer sat on the porch of his quarters counting the first payment Jonathan had pressed into his calloused hands. The coins clinked softly, each one a promise of power. He smiled into the darkness, already imagining what further profit might come if he tightened the noose a little more. In his mind, the secret was no longer a risk, it was a possession, and in Charleston, possession was everything. From that day forward, Silas Red watched the Beaumont household with new satisfaction. The garden meetings grew fewer, the laughter quieter, the glances briefer. Fear had begun its slow work, poisoning what had once been innocent defiance. In a world built on power and silence, the overseer had found a new way to rule, through knowledge, through threat, and through the kind of cruelty that never needed to raise its voice. The days that followed were drenched in the kind of silence that changes a person. The mansion remained outwardly serene, its routines unbroken, but within its walls, something fragile was beginning to fray. Jonathan Beaumont, once his father's pride, now lived as though each hour carried the weight of a confession waiting to be spoken. The world around him moved with the precision of habit, but inside him, nothing felt steady anymore. The arguments with his father, the threat from Silas Red, and the knowledge that Evelyn's very existence could be sold at any moment pressed against him like a tightening collar. One night, unable to sleep, Jonathan sat at his writing desk beneath the pale glow of a single candle. The ink trembled at the tip of his quill as he began to write, not to his father or to any figure of power, but to a friend in London, someone who had once believed, as he had, in the perfectibility of man. The letter began with restraint, almost civility, but soon the words grew desperate, heavy with anger and shame. He wrote of the hypocrisy that governed his world, of men who spoke of honor while trading lives like livestock, of churches filled with worshippers who prayed for salvation but never questioned the chains at their feet. He confessed that he had come to hate the sound of ledgers turning, the way each entry in ink erased something sacred. He wrote of Evelyn not by name, but in the language of reverence and remorse. He described the cruelty of love born in captivity, of tenderness that had no place to exist. His words burned onto the page, raw and unfiltered, until the ink smeared with the pressure of his hand. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, sealed it with wax, and stared at it for a long time. He knew he would never send it. The Atlantic was too wide, and truth, once spoken, had a way of finding its way to the wrong ears. He placed the letter in a drawer and left it there, a confession buried beneath the weight of his own cowardice. Elsewhere, in the quiet of the servants' quarters, Evelyn wrote too. By the dim light of a dying candle, she held a scrap of paper she had found discarded in the study, its edges rough, its surface smudged with ink. She wrote not to anyone she knew, but to herself, because it was the only place her thoughts could live safely. Her handwriting was careful, the letters small and deliberate. She wrote of freedom, not the grand freedom spoken of in northern pamphlets, but the simple kind she imagined in her dreams. The freedom to walk without fear, to sleep without waking to footsteps in the dark, to look upon her brother and know no man could sell him again. She wrote of sunlight on water, of laughter unchained, of breathing without permission. In her dream, freedom was not loud. It was quiet, steady, like the rhythm of a heart that no longer raced. She wrote that she wished to see a day where her name belonged to no one but herself. The candle burned low as she folded the paper, pressed it to her chest, and hid it beneath the loose board beneath her cot. That night, in different corners of the same house, two souls wrote words that would never be read. Jonathan's letter was an indictment of the world that had made him complicit. Evelyn's a prayer to the one she hoped still existed within her. Between them stretched a silence filled with everything they could not say aloud. The letters remained unsent, but in their ink lived the truth of what neither dared to speak. That love, in a world ruled by ownership, was its own act of rebellion. Summer settled over Charleston like a fever that would not break. The air itself felt heavy, each breath carrying the scent of salt and sweat, of magnolia and decay. The days grew longer, but for Jonathan Beaumont, time no longer felt like sunlight stretching across the hours, it felt like pressure. Each dawn carried the same dread that someone would speak his secret aloud, that a careless word or glance would expose the truth he was paying so dearly to hide. The cost of silence was rising, and the man collecting it was Silas Red. The overseer had become bolder since his first demand. The money Jonathan had given him was spent as quickly as it was earned, and greed had only sharpened his hunger. Now, he appeared at odd hours outside the carriage house, near the garden, or on the back steps of the mansion, his voice always low, but his meaning unmistakable. He wanted more. He spoke of debts and discretion, of loyalty that must be maintained, and Jonathan understood that there was no end to this arrangement. Red was a man who fed on fear, and he had found a feast in Jonathan's desperation. To meet the overseer's latest price, Jonathan began selling what little he could claim as his own. The first to go was his pocket watch, a gift from his father on the day he left for London. It had once marked the passing of hours in a world that felt secure and ordered. Now, it became the ransom for another man's silence. He traded it quietly at a jeweler's stall on Meeting Street, accepting a handful of coins that seemed too light to bear the weight of what they were meant to buy. At night, he found ways to pass a portion of those coins to Noah, Evelyn's brother. The young man had begun whispering of escape of a route north through the swamps, of men and women who could guide those brave enough to flee. The plan was fragile, half-formed, yet it carried the fragile hope of freedom. Jonathan knew it was madness to aid him, that discovery would destroy them all, but he could not bring himself to stop. Each coin he pressed into Noah's hand felt like defiance, a quiet refusal to let the world continue unchallenged. Evelyn knew nothing of the payments at first. She only saw the fatigue in Jonathan's eyes, the weight in his shoulders, and sensed that something unseen was closing in. The mansion itself seemed to conspire against them. Conversation stopped when they entered a room. Servants whispered of Red's late-night patrols. Even Alaric Beaumont had begun to notice his son's distraction, his absences, the strange tension that now haunted the house like a shadow too large to ignore. The heat thickened as August came, the air trembling above the cobblestones. Every sound carried every whisper, every breath. Red's gaze followed Jonathan wherever he went, a reminder that silence was never free. And though the coins kept the overseer's tongue still, they could not quiet the truth that both men understood. Money could buy secrecy, but not time. By the end of the month, the net had drawn tight around them all. Red watched with growing satisfaction. Noah planned with desperate hope. Evelyn prayed for deliverance she no longer believed in, and Jonathan felt himself sinking into the trap he had tried to outwit. The price of silence had been paid, but it had bought only a deeper kind of captivity. The house on East Bay Street still stood in its elegance, but within its walls, the foundations of everything the Beaumonts had built were beginning to tremble. The fire began in the harbor before dawn, when the city was still wrapped in fog and the world was caught between silence and awakening. It started as a flicker among the stacks of cotton bales behind the Beaumont and Sons warehouse. A single tremor of orange light reflected in the black water. Within minutes, it grew into a roaring inferno, devouring timber and canvas, sending columns of smoke spiraling into the pale morning sky. By the time the first bell clanged from Street Phillips, the flames had already leapt from one building to the next, feeding on oil, tar, and the restless wind that swept in from the sea. Charleston woke to the smell of burning fortune. From the balcony of the Beaumont mansion, the glow was unmistakable. It painted the harbor in a sickly red hue, turning the calm surface of the water into a mirror of ruin. Servants gathered in frightened whispers. Somewhere beyond the city's narrow streets, men shouted orders, chains clattered, and buckets of seawater were thrown into a blaze too powerful to be contained. Within hours, half the inventory of Beaumont and Sons had turned to ash crates of sugar and tobacco, barrels of rum, and a full season's worth of cotton waiting for shipment to Liverpool. By mid-morning, rumors had already begun to spread. Some claimed the fire was an accident caused by a careless worker's lantern. Others whispered of sabotage, a deliberate act meant to cripple Alaric Beaumont's empire. Rivals, abolitionists, or perhaps an enemy closer to home. The city's merchants gathered in clusters near the docks, their faces pale with greed disguised as concern, watching the smoke rise like a signal of divine justice. Inside his study, Alaric read the first report with trembling hands that betrayed what his voice would not. He was a man who had built his life upon control. Control of men, of numbers, of circumstance, and now that order had turned against him. His mind began immediately to sort through possibilities, weighing betrayal against misfortune. When the thought of Jonathan entered that calculus, it did not leave. His son had grown distant, erratic, defiant. He had spoken too often of conscience, of justice, of change. The timing was too precise, the silence too deliberate. Alaric's fear became suspicion, and suspicion hardened into certainty. By the time the last embers were extinguished, father and son stood on opposite sides of an invisible war. Alaric forbade Jonathan from leaving the property, declaring it a precaution, though both knew it was a sentence. The mansion gates were locked, the carriages kept under watch, and Silas Red was given new instructions to observe, to report, to remind the heir of his obligations. The overseer obeyed with quiet satisfaction, his loyalty secured by the same gold that once purchased his silence. For Jonathan, confinement felt like drowning in still air. The city sounds, church bells, merchant shouts, the crash of waves reached him only as echoes through the barred windows. He watched smoke from the docks drift over the harbor for days. The color of regret. Every plume rising into the sky seemed to carry a piece of his father's empire with it, a monument to greed finally consumed by the thing it had always feared: consequence. Charleston whispered of Beaumont's misfortune, some with pity, others with thinly veiled delight. Yet beneath the gossip ran a darker truth that none could name. The fire had not only burned wood and cotton, it had ignited something within the Beaumont household itself. Trust had turned to suspicion, blood to bitterness, and from the ashes of the dockyard rose a new and dangerous resolve. Alaric Beaumont would rebuild his empire, even if it meant sacrificing everything that still tied him to his own son. The moon was thin that night, a pale sliver hanging over Charleston like a blade. The air was heavy with heat and river mist, and the cicadas had gone silent, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Jonathan Beaumont stood in the shadow of the carriage house, his hands trembling as he fastened the cloak around Evelyn's shoulders. Every movement felt sharpened by fear, every heartbeat a countdown. Beyond the iron gates of the mansion, freedom waited, or ruin. There would be no second chance. Noah was already waiting by the back road, a sack slung across his shoulder, his face drawn tight with urgency. He had spent weeks mapping the route under cover of darkness, gathering whispers from other servants and dock workers. The plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. They would leave the estate just after midnight, cut through the outer fields, and reach the river before dawn. There, a boatman sympathetic to runaways would ferry them to the next town. From there, they would find passage north on a riverboat bound for Richmond. Beyond that lay uncertainty, but also the faint shimmer of hope. The city was asleep when they slipped into the night. The gravel crunched softly beneath their feet as they followed the narrow path along the marsh. A low mist clung to the ground, curling around their legs like smoke. Behind them, the mansion loomed dark and silent, its windows blackened, its master unaware that his son had chosen treason over inheritance. Every step carried the weight of finality. As they neared the outskirts, the scent of the harbor reached them, the thick mix of salt, tar, and decay. Lanterns flickered in the distance, marking the edge of the docks where ships creaked in their moorings. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Each glimmer of light felt like salvation and danger entwined. Evelyn's hand brushed his, a fleeting touch that steadied him. Noah led them through the alleyways, past sleeping warehouses and the faint murmur of guards on patrol. The world seemed to narrow into sound, the whisper of the tide, the scrape of rope against wood, the rhythmic beat of their footsteps. They reached the river just before dawn, the horizon beginning to pale with the first hint of morning. The boat waited, tethered beneath the shadow of an abandoned pier. Freedom was only a few yards away, but in the stillness, Evelyn stopped. She turned her head sharply, her breath catching. From the distance came the sound of hooves on cobblestone, faint but closing fast. Noah's eyes widened. The alarm had been raised. Silas Red had woken early that morning, suspicious of the quiet. He had seen the tracks in the dirt behind the stables, the prints too fine to belong to field hands. By the time he reached the gates, the overseer had gathered 3 men with rifles and dogs trained for the hunt. Now their shouts tore through the mist, breaking the fragile calm of the riverbank. Jonathan urged Evelyn forward, but the light was rising too quickly. The river no longer offered cover. The boatman hesitated, glancing toward the approaching riders. In the growing dawn, everything became visible: the fugitives, the boat, the betrayal written in the sky. The escape ended before it began. Noah drew his sister close, his eyes defiant even in defeat. Jonathan stepped between them, his body shaking, his mind already racing through the consequences that would come. The sound of the river was drowned by barking dogs and pounding hooves. When the first rays of sunlight broke over Charleston Harbor, the dream of freedom dissolved into smoke. What had begun as a desperate flight through the night became a reckoning. The river still flowed northward, carrying with it the reflection of 3 souls who had almost made it, who had reached the edge of deliverance before being pulled back into the grasp of a world determined to own them. Morning came with a cruel brightness, as though the sun itself refused to show mercy. The air was heavy, damp from the night's failed escape, and the streets of Charleston stirred with uneasy whispers. Word had spread quickly through the Beaumont estate, and beyond that Alaric Beaumont's son had betrayed his own blood, that a woman from the household had run, that the family's honor demanded retribution. The truth, like all truths in Charleston, had already been reshaped into something more convenient for the powerful. The people did not question, they gathered. In the courtyard behind the mansion, a crowd formed in the heat. Servants were summoned from their quarters, field hands from the edges of the property, and merchants who owed favors to Alaric arrived to watch, to witness, to prove their loyalty through silence. the scent of magnolia mixed with the stench of sweat and fear. In the center of the square stood a wooden post, stained and worn from years of punishment. It had been cleaned before dawn for this occasion. Evelyn was brought forward, her wrists bound, her face pale but unbroken. She moved with the dignity of someone who had already lost everything worth fearing. Her brother Noah was nowhere to be seen, dragged away before sunrise to some unseen fate. Jonathan was there, restrained by his father's men, his arms pinned behind his back as he struggled against them. The world had narrowed to that single terrible image before him, Evelyn standing beneath the rising sun, her hair loose, her eyes fixed on something far away, beyond the courtyard, beyond the pain to come. Alaric Beaumont stood on the mansion steps, his presence commanding the attention of all. He was not a man moved by passion but by principle, his version of it anyway. To him, order was sacred. Reputation was law. His son's disobedience had wounded more than pride. It had threatened the foundation of everything he had built. The punishment, he declared, was not cruelty, but necessity. His voice was calm as he spoke of betrayal, of disobedience, of sin. Then, without raising his tone, he gave the order. The sound that followed cut through the morning air like thunder. The whip cracked once, then again, each strike echoing against the stone walls of the house. Evelyn did not cry out. Her silence was more haunting than any scream could have been. The onlookers shifted uneasily, some turning their heads, others staring with the grim fascination of those too afraid to look away. Jonathan called her name, his voice breaking, but his father's men held him fast. He pulled until his wrists bled, his heart pounding in his chest, every fiber of him burning with helpless rage. By the time it ended, the courtyard had gone still. Evelyn was carried away, her body limp, her spirit somewhere beyond the reach of the men who had sought to break it. Jonathan fell to his knees, shaking with a grief that felt too large for words. His father approached, his face carved from stone. He looked down at his son not with anger, but with finality. "You are no longer mine," Alaric said, his voice steady as judgment. "The moment you chose her, you ceased to be my blood." The words landed heavier than the lash. Jonathan felt them hollow him out, stripping away whatever fragments of belonging still clung to his name. The crowd began to disperse, their footsteps soft against the courtyard stones, their silence complicit. Only the wind remained, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of blood and the echo of a vow Jonathan had never spoken aloud. That day marked the death of Alaric's heir and the birth of something far more dangerous, a man who no longer feared ruin, because he had already lost everything worth saving. And as the sun rose higher over Charleston, its light fell upon a city unchanged, blind to the truth that its own foundations had just begun to crumble. Night fell over Charleston like a curtain drawn to conceal wicked dealings. And within that darkness, Jonathan Beaumont made the most desperate decision of his life. He moved quietly through the back streets, his collar pulled high and his hat low, the soft click of his boots drowned by the hum of crickets and the murmur of the river. The city was sleeping, or pretending to, but he knew that some places never truly rested, especially where power and money spoke louder than conscience. His destination was one such place, the private chambers of Judge Horatio Blythe. Blythe's house stood at the end of a cobbled lane near the courthouse, an elegant structure draped in ivy, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of a beast that never closed. The judge had been Charleston's silent ruler for years, the man who decided which sins could be cleansed with gold and which would be punished with rope. He was feared more than loved, but he was also the only man who could grant what Jonathan now sought, a legal document capable of performing a miracle in a land that denied them. Jonathan entered through a side door, guided by a servant who knew better than to ask questions. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and old paper, the scent of countless judgments rendered in ink and indifference. Judge Blythe sat behind a polished desk, a glass of brandy in his hand and a faint smirk curling his lips. His eyes, pale and calculating, studied Jonathan as one might study a specimen. He already knew why the merchant's son had come. Word traveled fast in Charleston, and desperation was a fragrance men like Blythe recognized instantly. Jonathan spoke of manumission, of a single name written on a document that could turn bondage into freedom, Evelyn's freedom. He spoke quickly, his voice shaking but his resolve clear. He offered everything: his inheritance, his share of the family business, even his claim to the land his ancestors had owned for generations. The judge listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When Jonathan finished, Blythe leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as if weighing the worth of the offer. He agreed, but not without conditions. The price, he said, was not measured in gold or property but in allegiance. He wanted something more enduring than money, a favor that would bind Jonathan as tightly as the woman he sought to free had once been bound. There was a debt owed to the court, a secret case requiring the manipulation of evidence, a signature that could shift ownership from one family to another. If Jonathan agreed to assist, Evelyn's papers would be drawn, signed, and sealed before the week's end. The proposition hung in the room like smoke. Jonathan understood what it meant: corruption masquerading as mercy. To save Evelyn, he would have to stain his own name beyond redemption. For a moment, he hesitated. But then he saw her face in his mind, the quiet strength, the light in her eyes that no whip or threat could extinguish, and he knew there was no choice left. When he left the judge's house, the first hint of dawn colored the horizon. The city was still sleeping, unaware that one of its sons had just sold his soul to buy another's freedom. He carried no document, no proof, only the weight of his bargain and the bitter taste of compromise. The cobblestones beneath his feet glistened with dew, or perhaps tears, as the sun rose over a world that would never forgive him for what he had done or for whom he had done it. And somewhere deep within the mansion on East Bay Street, Evelyn stirred from uneasy sleep, unaware that the man who loved her had traded his name, his blood, and his future to set her free. The cost of that freedom, however, had only begun to unfold. Evening fell with the gentleness of ritual, and for the last time, the lamps of the Beaumont mansion flickered to life across East Bay Street. The dining room had been prepared with the precision of ceremony, the linen pressed to perfection, the silver polished until it caught every glimmer of light. Crystal glasses stood like soldiers awaiting command. It was a room that had seen countless dinners over the years, each one a quiet affirmation of the Beaumont family's order, its authority, its illusion of permanence. Tonight, however, that illusion trembled, though no one but Jonathan could feel the weight of it. He sat opposite his father at the long mahogany table, the air between them colder than the wine that filled their glasses. His mother, Margaret, sat at her place as always, her posture straight, her expression fixed in the polished serenity of a woman trained never to reveal discomfort. The only sound was the measured clatter of cutlery and the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. Outside, the harbor wind brushed against the shutters, whispering secrets through the cracks. Alaric Beaumont spoke first, as he always did. His voice carried that same smooth authority it had held all Jonathan's life. A sound that filled rooms and silenced doubt. He spoke of legacy and endurance, of the family's duty to survive the trials that befell lesser men. He spoke of honor and blood, of discipline that separated builders from the built upon. Then he raised his glass and offered a toast to the name that would outlive them all, to the foundation that must remain unbroken. To legacy, he said, his eyes fixed on Jonathan. And to obedience. Jonathan lifted his glass, his hand steady though his heart was not. The ruby light of the wine shimmered against his reflection, and for a moment he saw not himself but the man his father wanted him to be: obedient, ruthless, silent. He drank without a word. The taste was bitter, metallic, like guilt swallowed whole. Dinner continued, but conversation faltered. His father filled the quiet with talk of business, of rebuilding the dockyards after the fire, of new partnerships that would restore their fortune. Margaret nodded at intervals, her thoughts elsewhere. Jonathan said nothing. Each word from Alaric sounded to him like the tolling of a bell, each plan another chain clinking into place. He realized then that the man across the table would never understand him, that the love between them, if such a thing had ever existed, had already died, buried beneath pride and principle. When the plates were cleared and the servants withdrew, Alaric spoke of the future, outlining Jonathan's place in the company, the estate, the family legacy. Jonathan listened, not as a son but as a witness to his own departure. He knew that before the next sunrise, he would be gone from this house forever. The bargain with Judge Blythe had already been made. His fortune, his name, even his inheritance, all of it had been traded for one woman's freedom. As the final glass was emptied, Jonathan looked around the room for the last time. The portraits on the walls, the gleam of candlelight on silver, the smell of oak and wine, all of it belonged to a world he could no longer inhabit. His father's empire, built on cruelty and pride, would continue without him, but not untouched. When he rose from his chair, Alaric said nothing. Their eyes met across the table, and in that silent exchange, they both understood that this was farewell. One had chosen order, the other, conscience. One would die protecting his name, the other would live trying to redeem it. Outside, the harbor wind grew stronger, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea and the promise of escape. Jonathan stepped into the night, leaving behind not just a house, but a history written in chains. The lights of the mansion glowed behind him, steady and bright, unaware that their heir had already chosen to let them fade. The night Silas Red made his choice, the air over Charleston was thick and wet, the sky swollen with clouds that hid the moon. The harbor, usually alive with the music of trade, was eerily quiet. The masts of ships rocked gently against the tide, their rigging sighing like ghosts. Along the wharf, a single lantern bobbed in the overseer's hand as he led his horse through the fog, guiding the wagon that carried Evelyn toward the docks. To anyone watching, it was a simple transport, a servant being reassigned, a routine exchange between plantations. But the truth was far darker. Red had taken his payment from both sides. Alaric Beaumont believed the overseer was fulfilling an order made in the interest of the family's stability, removing a problem that had stained their name. Jonathan, though absent from the mansion, believed the opposite, that Red was assisting with Evelyn's release, ensuring her passage to safety. In truth, the overseer served neither master, he served only himself. The gold he carried in his pocket, warm from his grasp, had come from a New Orleans trader with a reputation for discretion and cruelty. Red had made his bargain with ease, convincing himself that loyalty was a fool's game and that freedom, even for a man like him, could be purchased in silver. Evelyn sat silently in the back of the wagon, her wrists bound, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The city's lights flickered behind her like distant stars fading into fog. She knew she was being taken from Charleston, though not where or why. Every turn of the wheel felt like the closing of a door. The overseer did not speak. He had no need to. His greed had already spoken for him. By the time they reached the docks, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, until the planks beneath their feet gleamed like mirrors. The slave ship, the Dauphine, loomed in the darkness, its sails furled, its deck crowded with shadowed figures. A man in a dark coat approached, exchanging a quiet word with Red before handing over a small pouch of coins. That was all it took. The overseer stepped back, his part complete. As Evelyn was led up the gangplank, her figure swallowed by the storm, he turned away without a word. What happened next would pass quickly into rumor, and then into legend. The Dauphine departed before dawn, sailing south along the coast toward the Gulf. It never reached New Orleans. 3 days later, a tempest rose out of the Atlantic, tearing through the Florida Straits with a fury that seemed almost divine. Fishermen along the shoreline reported seeing a flash of lightning, a single mast snapping like a bone, and then nothing but waves. When the storm passed, fragments of wood washed ashore, splintered beams, a broken crate, a single shoe. The sea had claimed the ship and everyone aboard. News of the disaster reached Charleston within the week. Alaric Beaumont heard first, and though he hid his reaction, a deep unease settled over him. Jonathan heard later, carried by a whisper from the docks, and the truth shattered what remained of his heart. He searched the manifests, the weather logs, The tide records anything that might prove she had survived, but the sea offered no answers. Silas Red said nothing. He kept his coins buried beneath his floorboards and told himself that storms came to all men sooner or later. Yet sometimes, late at night, when thunder rolled in from the coast, he swore he could hear the wind carry a voice, a woman's voice, calm and unbroken, calling from somewhere beyond the waves. And though he would never admit it, every sound of the sea reminded him that betrayal, like the ocean, never truly sleeps. Winter crept into Charleston quietly, softening the sharp edges of the city with a chill that seemed to mute everything it touched. The harbor lay still beneath a veil of mist, and the once bustling streets had fallen into a kind of uneasy calm. The fire at the dockyards, the scandal within the Beaumont family, the whispers of treachery each had faded into the background hum of Southern gossip. Yet for Jonathan Beaumont, the world remained hollow. He walked through his father's estate like a man already buried, the corridors echoing with silence and the ghosts of words left unspoken. Evelyn's name was never mentioned, but it lived in every corner, every shadow, every breath. It had been months since her disappearance. The sea had claimed the ship that carried her away, or so the city believed. The records said it plainly. The Dauphine, lost in a storm, no survivors. Jonathan had read the notice 100 times, tracing each letter until the ink blurred. Some nights, he dreamed of her standing at the edge of the water, her eyes clear and calm, calling to him through the roar of the waves. Other nights, he woke with her name on his lips and the weight of helplessness pressing on his chest. Then, one morning, as frost clung to the iron gates, a letter arrived. The paper was creased, its corners soft from handling, the writing faint and water-stained. The courier who delivered it said it had been found aboard a wreck off the Florida coast, tucked inside a leather satchel that washed ashore weeks after the storm. There was no signature, no seal, but Jonathan knew the handwriting before he even opened it. It was hers. The words were faint, the ink smudged by salt, but the voice that spoke from the page was clear. She wrote of the sea, of a storm that came upon them without warning, and of a night spent clinging to a shattered piece of the ship as the world fell apart around her. She wrote that she had lived somehow rescued by fishermen who carried her inland. She did not name the place, only said it was far from Charleston, far from the chains that had bound her. She spoke of freedom, not as an idea, but as a feeling. She described the first morning she woke beneath an open sky without fear, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of her own laughter carried by the wind. And then, near the end, she wrote of something more. She spoke of a child, growing quietly within her. A life born not of captivity but of love. She said she would name the child Hope, because that was what she wished to leave behind if she could not live long enough to see the world she dreamed of. The letter closed with words that broke him more completely than any loss could have. If this reaches you, know that I am not gone. Not entirely. I live wherever kindness survives, wherever someone dares to believe that love can outlast cruelty. Live, Jonathan. Live for what we could not. He read it again and again until the paper began to crumble in his hands. The tears that came were not loud. They were quiet, steady, like rain on a grave. He pressed the letter to his heart and felt, for the first time in months, something other than despair. Evelyn was gone, but not erased. She had written herself into eternity with ink, salt, and courage. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of waves breaking along the shore. Jonathan looked toward the harbor, where the horizon met the gray winter sky, and he whispered her name into the cold air. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the storm, he imagined she heard him. Somewhere, her words still waited, carried by the tide. The house on East Bay Street had long since fallen quiet by the turn of the century. Its columns, once gleaming white, had dulled to the color of bone, and ivy now crawled over its walls like veins reclaiming a forgotten body. The Beaumont name still lingered in Charleston's records, whispered among those who remembered fortunes built on trade and tragedy, but the power it once carried had faded. Time had done what no rival or storm could reduce empire to memory. In the summer of 1901, the last surviving descendant, a young woman named Clara Beaumont, returned to the house her family had abandoned decades earlier. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story, told in half-truths and silences of a proud merchant, of a scandal that destroyed his lineage, of a ledger that no one dared to speak of. The mansion was to be sold now, its contents inventoried, its past finally buried beneath progress. But as she wandered through its decaying halls, dust stirring in the light that filtered through cracked shutters, she felt the pull of something unfinished. The attic was a cathedral of forgotten things. Old trunks lay open, their contents spilling out silk dresses eaten by moths, portraits with faces faded into ghosts, ledgers stacked like tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of dust and age. It was there, among the relics of a life long gone, that she found it. A single leather-bound book resting beneath a broken chair, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed but intact. The ledger of Beaumont and Sons. Clara opened it carefully, running her fingers across the neat rows of names and numbers. Each line was a transaction. Each entry a story of possession. She read for hours, tracing the history of her family's wealth written in the currency of lives. The handwriting grew shakier as the pages turned, the ink darkening in places, fading in others. And then she reached the final section, one page unlike the rest. Two names had been circled together in the margin: Jonathan Beaumont and Evelyn. The ink was faint, the handwriting uneven, as if written by a trembling hand. Beneath the names, in smaller script, were three words that stopped her breath. No sale. Freed by love. The attic seemed to grow still around her. She read the words again, certain they were not a trick of the light. It was not a transaction at all, but a confession, a final entry written not for profit but for redemption. Whoever had written it, whether Jonathan himself or someone who knew the truth, had broken the language of the ledger. Where every other line measured value in coin, this one measured it in something beyond the reach of commerce. Outside, the bells of Street Phillips began to toll, their sound drifting through the open window like a benediction. Clara closed the book and held it to her chest. In that quiet attic, surrounded by dust and ghosts, she felt the strange weight of inheritance, not of wealth, but of reckoning. The sins of her family could not be undone, but here, at least, was evidence that love had once defied them. When she left the house later that evening, the setting sun cast the mansion in amber light. The shadows stretched long across the floorboards, as if bowing to the names that time had tried to erase. The ledger remained behind on the attic table, open to that single, extraordinary line. And as the last rays of daylight touched the faded ink, it gleamed for a moment, as though the words themselves refused to die. No sale. Freed by love. It was not just an ending. It was a promise whispered through the years, carried by paper, blood, and memory that even in a world built on cruelty, the heart will always find a way to write its own redemption.